Hello, and welcome to KRAD COVID Readings. I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido, doing my bit to help the coronavirus blues. Throughout the first decade of the 2000s, Simon & Schuster put out a whole bunch of anniversary anthologies in the Star Trek line. It started in 2003, which was the 10th anniversary of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, with the anthology Prophecy and Change, for which I wrote the story Broken Oaths, which I read on an earlier reading installment. In 2005, for the 10th anniversary of Star Trek Voyager, they released Distant Shores, for which I wrote Letting Go, which I also read in a previous thing. In 2006, it was the 40th anniversary of the original series, and they released an anthology called Constellations, to which I did not contribute. And then in 2007, it was the 20th anniversary of Star Trek The Next Generation. It was actually pretty funny, because everybody was like, oh yeah, 10 years since Deep Space Nine, that makes sense. And, oh yeah, 10 years since Voyager, yeah, okay. And 40 years since the original series, but that was a long time ago. And then 2007 came and said, 20 years since The Next Generation! Holy crap, I'm old! Anyway, this final of the four anthology series, since there are only four series, well, Enterprise also, but Enterprise had only just gone off the air for 2 years in 2007. For the final of these anniversary anthologies, it was called The Sky's the Limit, which were the final words spoken on The Next Generation. And the object Marco Palmieri had was to cover the entire range of stories from Next Generation, from the first season all the way through to a story that took place around the time of Star Trek Nemesis. What happened was he had gotten most of the stories assembled, and he realized that he had stories that focused on all of the characters except for Jean-Luc Picard, which, considering he's, the captain, was kind of an issue. So Marco came to me. He originally wasn't going to have me do a story for the book, because he was trying to keep variety. So, I was already into the anthologies, and that's fine. But then that happened. So he came to me and said, hey, Keith, can you do a Picard story and maybe have it take place during the Dominion War? Because he only had one other story that took place then, and he could use another. So I did. The story I decided to tell was one that revisited one of Next Generation's best episodes, which was the two-parter Chain of Command, in which Picard was captured by Cardassians and tortured by a Gul named Madred, played by David Warner. To make it more interesting and to do something a little different, I wrote the story in the first person. I did this without thinking about the consequences to me as a reader of my fiction, which means I have to kind of try to read it in Patrick Stewart's voice, since I'm not a British Shakespearean actor, will be a challenge, but we'll do our best. Anyway, so without further ado, here is a story called Four Lights from Star Trek The Next Generation, The Sky is the Limit, by Keith R.A. DeCandido, and here it is. I watched the Grissom die. I never used to anthropomorphize starships that way. I used to find the human tendency to give vessels a personality to be suspect and possibly dangerous. I've lost two commands, the Stargazer at Maxia Zeta and the Enterprise D at Viridian 3, and I weathered those ships' losses primarily because I viewed them solely as objects. Since the commencement of the Dominion War over a year ago, however, I'd seen so many ships destroyed, seen so many proud Starfleet vessels reduced to debris or less. You would think that multiple exposure to such would have inured me, made me view them as even more as things than living creatures. But I found that I felt the loss of the ships more keenly than ever before. Perhaps it was by way of avoiding feeling the loss of sentient life. The Grissom's crew complement was 1,250. Easier to lament the loss of a single ship than over 1,000 lives. And perhaps that feeling was due to helplessness. The Grissom was one of 10 Allied ships at Richter Prime, 6 Starfleet ships, including my own Enterprise E, and 4 Klingon Defense Force vessels, against 4 Jem'Hadar attack ships, and 2 Cardassian Galor-class cruisers. Numerically, the odds would be in our favor, but the Jem'Hadar did not require numbers to have an advantage. Both sides lost 1 ship each at the start of the battle. One of the Galors and the USS Winchester destroyed each other. We were likewise unable to save the Grissom, which now hung dead in space, as we were too busy coming to the aid of the USS Christopher. My chair vibrated beneath me as the Enterprise took fire from the remaining Galor, the Elokar, which was trying to send the Christopher to the same fate as the Grissom. Will Riker, my first officer, was directing the battle. To our tactical officer, Lieutenant Daniels, he said, "Full torpedoes spread to their engines on my mark." "Aye, sir." "Ensign Parham," he said to the con officer, Change course to 197 Mark 5, but at full impulse. After a second, Mark! I nodded my approval of Will's plan. The Enterprise had been at 1/8 impulse, and the sudden burst of speed would catch the Cardassians off guard. It also gave Daniels only a slim window of opportunity to fire on the Elokar. Of the spread of 6 quantum torpedoes, 2 missed their mark. However, the other 4 struck, the detonations flowering across the Cardassian cruiser. From the operations station, Data reported calmly. The Elokar has suffered catastrophic engine damage. Their warp core will breach in 7 minutes. Will got up from his seat to my right and walked around to the tactical station behind him. Standing next to Daniels, he said, "Ready tractor beam. As soon as the Cardassians eject the core, lock onto it and send it right at the Jem'Hadar." I added, "Mr. Data, alert the other vessels, particularly the Klingons, of that tactic." Data nodded and said calmly, "Aye, sir." Not for the first time, I envied him his ability to switch his emotions off at will. Data continued. USS Vaklar and IKS Courtier closing in on the 3rd Jem'Hadar vessel. IKS Warvig and USS Tamala engaging 2nd Jem'Hadar vessel. IKS Yavang taking heavy damage from the 4th Jem'Hadar vessel. "The Cardassians have ejected the core," Daniel said from behind me. "Engaging tractor beam." "First Jem'Hadar vessel coming about," Data said. That was the one that destroyed the Grissom. "Do it, Mr. Daniels," Will said. "Aye, sir." The blue tractor beam engulfed the Elokar's critical warp core and redirected it toward the Grissom's murderer. It would seem I was indeed anthropomorphizing. Even as the Elokar's warp core destroyed 1 Jem'Hadar ship, 2 others were taking considerable damage from the 4 Allied vessels. But then they changed course. I felt the blood drain from my face. I rose to my feet and said, "Data, warn them! They're about to—" But it was too late. The Jem'Hadar introduced themselves to the Alpha Quadrant 5 years ago, in a suicide run against the USS Odyssey, a sister ship to the Enterprise D. These 2 Dominion attack ships did likewise, taking out 3 of their enemy at the same time. Only the Tamala recognized the tactic as I did and veered away in time, though they took on considerable hull damage from the explosion. After a moment of quiet on the bridge, Data spoke. "The Yavang's impulse engines are offline, and their warp drive has engaged emergency shutdown. They are—" My second officer cut off his report when the final Jem'Hadar ship went to warp. "Ensign, heading," I asked Perrin. "Their heading is 111 Mark 19, back to Dominion territory." Will came back around to the center of the bridge to stand next to me. "Do we pursue?" I hesitated. It was tempting to hunt them down, but nothing would be gained. The Dominion's attempt to take Richter Prime had failed. Our enemy would gain no new intelligence from this endeavor. All the ships involved were surely already known to the Dominion, and no particularly inventive tactics were used, so we had nothing to lose by allowing 1 ship full of Jem'Hadar to escape. Besides, even if we did pursue them and destroy them, the Dominion would simply make more. Staring at the screen, I saw only death. The debris clouds of the vaporized vessels, the dimmed lights of the ships that were damaged. The only real survivor was the planet below, Richter Prime, the Zaldan colony we were trying to protect. Daniel said, "Incoming call from the Tamala, sir. It's Captain Del Orso." I nodded and sat back down in my chair. Will did likewise next to me. "On screen, Lieutenant." The scene of death was replaced by the haggard image of Kirsten Del Orso. "Looks like we're the last one standing, Captain Picard." "Indeed. Do you require any assistance?" Batting a lock of dark hair out of her sweat-streaked face, Del Orso said, We're fine, but we're also picking up 3 escape pods near the debris of the Grissom." "Confirmed," Data said. Reading 6 life signs. My chief engineer's having a fit as it is. I'd rather not add maneuvering in that mess to her worries. "Of course. We'll take care of it, Captain." To the con, Will said, "Ensign Perham, set a course for those pods. Lieutenant Daniels, ready tractor beam." "Speaking of tractor beams," Del Orso said, "that was a nice trick you pulled with the Elokar's warp core." She let out a breath, puffing her cheeks. "I'm really glad you guys were assigned to this detail. Without you, the Zaldans would be brushing up on the Vorda's language by now. Thanks to you, we won." I thought about 6 people who were the only survivors of a ship of 1,200, and 5 other ships that didn't have as many as 6 survivors, and I shook my head. This does not feel like victory. The day after what was already being referred to as the Battle of Richter Prime, I stood outside Deanna Troy's office, feeling a fool. The bridge of the Enterprise had not felt right of late. That was due in part to 2 who were missing. One was Worf, now serving on Deep Space Nine. Still, Patrick Daniels had been serving more than adequately at Tactical since the Enterprise E's earliest days. However, it was the other person missing who concerned me at present, Counselor Deanna Troy. She still served on the Enterprise, of course, but she spent comparatively little time by my side on the bridge. Indeed, instead, her presence was required most often either in her office or in sickbay with Dr. Crusher, tending to those who needed her aid. The doors parted, and Ensign Lobato, one of Commander LaForge's engineers, came out. She nodded and said, "Captain," and continued down the corridor. Deanna was sitting in her chair, reading a pad. She didn't look up when the doors closed behind me, as she probably thought they were closing on Lobato. But then she looked up, her face brightening. "Captain, I wasn't expecting you." I gamely attempted a smile of my own. I would have thought you'd have sensed me coming. She set the pad down. "Lately I've been taking to putting up mental barriers. The emotions of the crew are very strong under these circumstances, and..." She trailed off, but I understood. Indicating her patient's chair, I asked, "May I?" "Is this a session?" I hesitated. "Perhaps an informal one, I suppose..." Another hesitation. "I suppose I have grown accustomed to having you by my side." "You know my door is always open to you, Captain. What's troubling you? Is it that obvious?" She smirked. "Perhaps not to the crew, but I know you a bit better." Nodding, I said, "I've been thinking back over yesterday's battle. When hostilities with the Dominion started to flare up, I was naturally concerned that war would be the eventual result, particularly once Cardassia joined the Dominion. I promised myself that I would never get so jaded that I would take pleasure in the taking of another life. It was easy at first. We were very rarely sent to the front lines, after all. Starfleet preferred to hold us in reserve, use us for more diplomatic assignments. But now..." Deanna hardly needed me to finish the sentence. She'd been on board for all our missions, from the relatively sedate mission to Evora to the liberation of our homeworld of Beta Z. "Now you find you haven't been able to fulfill that promise." "No," I said in a whisper. "When Lieutenant Daniels used the Cardassian warp core to destroy the Jem'Hadar ship, I was glad. I was almost immediately ashamed, but at the moment of impact, I felt joy at the deaths of the Jem'Hadar who destroyed the Grissom. I knew her captain," I added, realizing I was anthropomorphizing again. "She was a fine officer, an excellent leader. And after I saw her ship pulverized, I wanted nothing more than the same fate meted out to those responsible." Deanna leaned toward me. "Captain, it's nothing to be ashamed of. What matters far more than your joy is the shame you felt right afterward. It's when you don't feel the shame after a perfectly natural instinct that you have to worry." As she leaned forward, I leaned back, crossing my legs in a failed attempt to get comfortable. "We're on our way now to meet with a Klingon civilian ship that allegedly has intelligence about Dominion activity, at which point we will likely again be sent into battle." I sighed. "Remember at Evora, when I asked if anyone remembered when we were explorers?" "Yes, and we will be explorers again, Captain. I'm sure of it. Assuming we do win the war. Assuming we aren't all killed. We've been so very lucky, Deanna. Even when we lost the Enterprise D, we all survived. But now I see the Grissom and the other 5 ships destroyed, the Christopher possibly needing to be scrapped as well, and I wonder when our luck will finally run out." "Captain..." "Riker to Picard!" I pulled down my uniform jacket and tapped my comm badge. "Go ahead, number 1. We're picking up a distress call from a Cardassian ship. It's adrift in interstellar space. Data picked it up on long range, and it seems to be legitimate. Normally I would recommend caution, but the urge to save a life rather than take one became almost palpable. Have Ensign Perham change course." After a moment I added, "And go to yellow alert. I'll be on the bridge shortly. Picard out." Getting to my feet, I turned to the counselor. I did not need her empathic senses to determine that she was worried about me. "Captain, I think we should speak further." "I agree, counselor, but later, in a formal session perhaps?" She picked up her pad. We agreed on a time the following afternoon, and I went to the bridge. The distress call came from an old Acryl class vessel. I was amazed that there were any still in service, as that model was prominent when I was captain of the Stargazer, but had become less common in recent years. As usual, Data had an explanation. "Sensors show several deviations from the known design of Acryl-class vessels. It is likely that Dominion engineering has been used to augment this ship." Will added, "The last squib from Starfleet Intelligence indicated that Cardassian shipyards have been converted by the Dominion to upgrade Central Command's fleet." "Well," Daniel said, "this upgrade must not have taken. I'm reading hull damage over 40% of the ship. Structural integrity's field down to 25% and falling, and the distress call is now a disaster beacon." Data added, "Ship's registry indicates that it is the Central Command vessel Pakliros." I tugged the front of my uniform jacket again, a comforting habit I'd never seen any reason to break, and said, "Bring us in slowly, Ensign." "Aye, sir," Perham said. Disaster beacons were far more difficult to forge, though not impossible, and increased the likelihood that this was a legitimate call for help. Will asked, "Any life signs data?" "The ship's engines are putting out considerable radiation, sir, making life sign readings difficult. However, sensors do read 2 Cardassian life signs in the forward cargo section." That put them as far as possible from the irradiated engines. I tapped my comm badge. "Bridge to Transporter Room 3. Lock onto the 2 life signs in the forward section of the Cardassian vessel and stand by." I moved toward the turbolift. "Mr. Daniels, have a security complement meet me in the transporter room." "Yes, sir." "You have the bridge, number 1. "Yes, sir." Will said, "Lieutenant, keep a weapons lock on the Pakleros, just in case." Daniels' acknowledgement was swallowed by the turbolift doors closing. "Transporter Room 3, I said. Will's caution was quite sensible. A Sovereign-class ship would be a valuable prize for a Dominion soldier to bring home to Cardassia Prime. This still could have been a trap. But it might not have been. If there were only 2 survivors, it meant the Pakleros was worse off than the Grissom. We'd saved those final 6. They'd been transported to the Tamala, who were tasked with towing the Christopher back to Starbase 522, and could we truly not do likewise for our enemies? Once, I would have had a much easier time answering that question. Ensign So, Jalak, and Cruzen from security were approaching the transporter room from the other direction. They all had their phasers out. There was a time when standard procedure was to leave one's weapon holstered until necessary, but those times had passed. I entered the transporter room, the 3 security officers trailing behind me. As they got into a triangle formation, weapons pointed to the platform, I turned to the transporter operator, Chief Tabans. The Vulcan woman said, "I have acquired a lock on the 2 Cardassians. Continued scans have detected no other life signs on the Pakleros." I nodded. "Energize." 2 Cardassians materialized, a man and a woman. The uniforms were torn and filthy, and both had evidence of injury. The woman had the insignia of a Glyn. However, I barely noticed her, as I found my entire focus on the man. It was a face I'd last seen in person on Cardassia Prime 6 years ago, but which I'd seen in my nightmares with alarming regularity ever since. Gul Madred. Palming the blood from around his right eye, the Cardassian Gul looked at me with as much shock as I'm sure I viewed him. "Captain Picard! What a surprise," he said flatly. The Glyn collapsed on the platform and started shaking. I turned to Devons. "Beamer to sickbay." I tapped my comm badge. "Picard to Crusher. Doctor, you're about to receive a wounded prisoner." "Understood." I looked back on the face of one of the few sentient beings for whom I had ever truly felt hatred. "Are there any other survivors?" Slowly, Madred shook his head. "No. Glindriana and I are the only ones left." "Very well." I affected a more formal tone of voice. "You are on board the USS Enterprise. By order of the Federation Council, I hereby declare you, Gul Madred, and Glindriana to be prisoners of war." I turned to Ensign So. "Take him to the brig. Alert sickbay, they can treat his wounds there." Without another look at his face, I left the transporter room. A Cardassian brings me into a large, dark room. My wrists are cuffed together in front of me. There is another Cardassian with small eyes and a Gul's insignia sitting behind a large desk. "A challenge," he says. Then he gets up and walks around the desk toward me. With a nod, he dismisses the one who brought me in, leaving us alone in the room together. "You should prove an interesting challenge. Possibly the most interesting to come through that door in many years." I ask, "What do you want?" "Why, you, of course," he says, as if it were blindingly obvious. "Picard. Jean-Luc." Beverly Crusher's voice startled me out of my reverie. It had been 6 years, yet I remembered my time with Madred as if it were last week. Indeed, I remembered it with greater clarity than I did the events of the previous week. But my chief medical officer was providing a report. "Yes, Beverly, I'm sorry. You were saying?" "My patient has received 3rd-degree burns over several parts of her body. I can treat that, but it's secondary to the greater issue. She has radiation poisoning. Luckily for her, we were able to access the Pakleros' medical database. She has a flag on her file that says she's allergic to hyronolin." "But there are alternative treatments," I said. She nodded, her red tresses bouncing slightly. "Yes, but they're less effective. I honestly don't know if I can save her." I could hear the fatigue in her voice. The war had gone on a year and a half, and wars are never easy times for physicians. I put what I hoped was a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Do what you can, Beverly." Again, she nodded. I squeezed her shoulder and then moved toward the exit. "Jean-Luc." I stopped and turned. Her expression had modulated to one of concern. "Are you all right?" Obviously, she had heard who the other prisoner was. "I'm fine," I lied. The look on her face indicated that she saw through that falsehood. "If you need to talk—" "Of course," I said dismissively and left sickbay. Now was not the time to indulge in emotionalism. I was captain of the Enterprise and I had a job to do. Daniels and Deanna were waiting for me in the corridor. My security chief spoke first. Captain, we've received orders from Starfleet Command. They'll send an SCE ship to tow the Pacleros back to Starbase 522. We're to proceed to the rendezvous with the Borzok and interrogate the prisoners here. Glancing back at sickbay, I said, Glindriana is in no condition to be questioned. Nodding, Daniels said, Understood, sir. I'll proceed to the brig then. No, I will handle Gul Madred's interrogation. Daniels frowned. Sir? I could feel Deanna's eyes burning a hole in me as I said, I believe my words were clear, Lieutenant. Yes, sir. Deanna said, Captain, are you sure? Yes, I said. I'm fully aware of my history with the Gul Counselor, and I hardly need you to remind me of it. Nevertheless, I shall interrogate him. Return to your posts. I turned my back on them before they could acknowledge me, and tapped my comm badge as I headed down the corridor toward the turbolift. Picard to bridge. Will replied, Go ahead. Proceed to the rendezvous with the Borzok, number 1. I'll be in the brig. There was a considerable pause before Will said, Yes, sir. Is there a problem, Commander? I asked, even though I knew the answer already. Sir, perhaps it would be more appropriate if Lieutenant Daniels or Counselor Troy... I've already spoken with both of them, number 1. I let out a breath. I appreciate your concern, Will. Carry out your orders. Aye, aye, sir. I entered the turbolift. Brig. In this room, you do not ask questions. I ask them. You answer. If I am not satisfied with your answers, you will die. It begins that way. It continues with drugs designed to compel the truth from me. I remember little of that, save that I answer every question I am asked. My next clear memory is of being brought back into the room, again cuffed, this time also blindfolded. Captain Picard. I waste no time in asserting my legal rights. I demand to see a neutral representative as required by the Federation Cardassian Peace Treaty. Madred removes the blindfold. We have already sent a message to Tovin 3, the nearest neutral planet. They assure us they will dispatch someone. It is the first lie Madred speaks to me. It is not the last. Madred's wounds were being treated by Ensign Mack, one of Beverly's medical technicians, when I entered the brig. Ensign So was in the brig with them, a phaser pointed directly at Madred's head should he try anything, but the Cardassian seemed uninterested in that. That almost disappointed me. A part of me wanted him to try to escape so could kill him. He would be justified in the act, especially if Mac's life was put in danger. I found myself visualizing the phaser burning through Madred's chest, his small eyes widening at the impact. But Madred did nothing. He merely sat on the bunk and allowed himself to be healed. Mac finished his work and nodded to So, who in turn nodded to Lieutenant Warner, the officer on duty at the brig controls. Warner lowered the force field. So kept his phaser on Madred as he and Mac departed the brig. Once they were clear, Warner raised the force field again. Only then did So lower his weapon. Mac walked up to me. He's fine, sir. Just a few scrapes and bruises. Thank you, Ensign. Nodding, Mac departed. I walked up to the edge of the force field. So, I noticed, did not leave, but took up position next to Warner's desk. I debated ordering them both out of the room, but standard procedure during wartime was for 2 security guards to be present during any interrogation, and I saw no reason to put either officer in a conundrum by ordering them to violate that procedure. Madred looked up at me, his face having been repaired. So it would seem fate has thrown us together again, human. I stepped forward. You're on board my ship, Gul Madred. You will address me as captain. Inclining his head, he said, My apologies. I'm afraid I'm far more accustomed to my role as jailer than jailed. He gave a small smile and added, How grateful I am that it is you who are my interrogator, Captain. So often in that room I found myself dealing with dullards and simpletons, enemies of the state who provided no challenge whatsoever. I feared that now, with the positions reversed, I would be confronted with a boorish chief of security who would badger me with tiresome questions. Such as asking you what you were doing on an outdated ship so far from Cardassian space, or, rather, from Dominion space? Again, he smiled. Yes, rather like that question. And you give the Acral class far too little credit. It's one of our finer designs. The smile fell, or rather it was. I had to admit that a certain smugness crept into my tone when I said, Your Dominion masters were unable to make the upgrades work, were they? They are hardly our masters, Captain. Madred's tone struck me as defensive. We are part of the Dominion now, not its slaves. Really? I started to pace back and forth in front of the force field. Your government is run by the Vorta. Oh, yes, I know, Legate Damar is nominally in charge, but he's obviously a puppet of the Founders. He can practically see the strings. Perhaps. But Cardassia is great once again. Cardassia is nothing. Your entire culture, your entire nation has been subsumed in order to become part of a larger totalitarian state. Madred whispered. And what, pray tell, was the alternative? Cardassia was in shambles, Captain. I am the last to lament the end of the Obsidian Order. They were a collection of paranoid fools. But their destruction left the government vulnerable to civilian takeover, which in turn left us even more vulnerable to outside attack. Our people were dying in droves. We lost worlds to Klingon aggression and Maquis terrorism. By joining the Dominion, Cardassian lives were saved. And how many more lives were lost since the war began? I would be a fool to deny that sacrifices have been made, but at least the losses now are primarily soldiers who have pledged to give their lives in service to Cardassia. When the Klingons attacked, they showed little interest in limiting themselves to military targets, and the Maquis were even more indiscriminate. A life is no less valuable because it has agreed to serve. All life is precious, Madred. He chuckled at that. What a charmingly naive point of view. Allow me to refute each of your points, Captain. Life is not at all precious. If it were, it wouldn't be so easily disposed of. As for the military, its primary function is to protect the state and the people within it. Of course a civilian life is of more value, because the military's job is to put itself in danger to protect civilians. There is no other conclusion to be reached from that position, unless your Starfleet does not protect civilians. Of course it does. Then why do you continue to fight the Dominion? Madred rose and walked toward the force field. You must see that this war is a tremendous waste. I raised an eyebrow. Then why do you continue to fight it? Another smile. That is my question to you, Captain. Why do you resist the inevitable? Why fight the Dominion? What alternative do we have? Join us! Madred spoke with passion now, more than I'd ever seen him evince. If you join the Dominion, you can save lives. A position your Federation, as well as the Klingons and Romulans, would have been far better off emulating rather than fighting. If you don't believe me, you need only to glance at your collective casualty figures to see that I am right. Now he was simply playing games, and I realized I was playing them as well. One of the last things Madred ever said to me before I was released from his torture chamber was, I would enjoy debating with you. You have a keen mind. Now, here we were, doing that very same thing. I wasn't about to continue letting him manipulate me. What were you doing on that ship, Madred? I can't imagine you were reduced to captaining an old wreck like that. I was not the Pacleros' shipmaster, if that is what you are asking, Captain, but I see no reason to share my mission with the likes of you. If not with me, then with one of those boorish security chiefs you were lamenting earlier. It would be easier for all of us if you spoke now. Madred turned and sat back down on the bunk. Perhaps. I would ask a boon in return for that information, however. A demand to see Glindriana. For the first time, I smiled. In this room, you do not make demands. With that, I turned and left the brig. He brings his daughter Jalora into the room, telling her that humans don't love their mothers and fathers the way they do. The usual tired propaganda regarding one's enemy. After she departs, I tell Madred the truth. Your daughter is lovely. Yes, I think so. And unusually bright. It's amazing, isn't it? The way they're able to sneak into your heart. I have to admit, I was completely unprepared for the power she had over me from the moment she was born. I am surprised that you let her come in here. Madred seems genuinely confused. Why? To expose a child to this, to someone who is suffering, to see that it's you who inflict that suffering. From the time Jalora could crawl, she's been taught about the enemies of Cardassia, the enemies of the Cardassians, and that enemies deserve their fate. When children learn to devalue others, they can devalue anyone, including their parents. He rises and walks toward me. What a blind, narrow view you have. What an arrogant man you are. I took my place on the bridge, ignoring the look of concern from my first officer as I sat next to him. Report, I said. We're approaching the rendezvous point, Will said. Data added, sensors are picking up the Borzak at the designated coordinates. Slow to impulse, I told Baron. Aye, sir, Trill said. Moments later, the stars on the main viewer that had been streaking by from the warp effect settled once again into single points in space. Data put the Borzak on the viewer. It didn't follow the avian design that the Klingon military favored, but the Empire's trefoil emblem was still prominent on its hull. Hail the Borzak, Mr. Daniels, I said. Moments later, a squat Klingon face appeared on the viewer. You are Picard of the Enterprise? I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard, yes. I was told it would be you. My name is Grantar of the House of KRAD, and I bear news of value to the war effort. The Dominion is constructing a large military base on the Cardassian world of Rachnow 5. It will include a weapons production plant, a Jem'Hadar base, and a Ketracel White facility. Will and I exchanged glances. He seemed dubious, and I felt much the same. How have they accomplished this in secret? I asked. They've matched their movements to the planet by traveling through the Betrica Nebula. What is the source of your intelligence? Many turns ago, Cardassians and Klingons both lived on Rachnar 5 before the Empire ceded the world to those spoon-headed Patakbu. Even after that, however, some Klingons remained on that world. One of them is a member of the House of KRAD. And you trust this family member? I asked. Normally, I would not insult a Klingon by even asking, but these were treacherous times, and besides, this was a civilian, not a warrior. Grantor broke into a wide smile at the question. He owes me 12 bricks of latinum, so the Todzar damn well better be telling me the truth. Definitely not a warrior, I thought. He went on. I have images that he took of the construction, which I will gladly share. From behind me, Daniel said, Receiving file now, sir. I nodded briefly to the tactical officer, then said, On behalf of the Allies, Grantor, I thank you for your intelligence. You're welcome, Picard of the Enterprise. In return, I ask only that you stop them. My housemate has enough trouble living on that rock without the Dominion turning it into their playground. After Grantor signed off, Will said, Lieutenant Daniel sent a secure message to Admiral Spahiu at Starbase 522. Aye, sir. Sick bay to Picard. I looked up. Go ahead, Doctor. Beverly hesitated before going on. I'm afraid that I've lost my patient. He takes the bejeweled knife and slices off my clothing, leaving me naked and exposed. From this point on, you will enjoy no privilege of rank, no privileges of person. From now on, I will refer to you only as human. You have no other identity. His men shackle me to a pole that hangs from the ceiling, leaving my arms raised. Then he touches his pad, and the pole retracts, lifting my legs from the floor. He walks out, leaving me alone to hang like that for the entire night. The next morning, his men take me down while he drinks in front of me, knowing how parched I am. Thirsty? He asks, unnecessarily. I would imagine so. He drinks again. Well, it's time to move on. My voice cracking, I say, I've told you all that I know. Yes, I'm sure you have. He touches a control on his pad, and the 4 lights behind his head blaze into existence, temporarily blinding me. I blink the spots out of my eyes as he asks, How many lights do you see there? Thinking it a simple question, I say, I see 4 lights. No, there are 5. You're quite sure? There are 4 lights. As soon as I entered the brig, Madred said, I wish to see Glindriana. Ignoring his request, I said, I'm afraid your remanding to a starbase will have to wait a while longer. Why is that? I tilted my head. Does it matter? Well, if you are engaging in a mission that will endanger Cardassian lives, then it matters a great deal to me. What were you doing on the Pakliros? Why does that matter to you? Madred had been sitting on his bunk, but now he rose and walked over to the small water basin. I must confess to being greatly disappointed in you, human. You've been given an unparalleled opportunity, and you're wasting it. He splashed some water on his face. To do what? I asked. To get some of my own back? To torture you as you did me? He whirled around, his face still wet. Torture? I did no such thing. That stunned me. I almost lost my footing. Then I recalled that the entire time I was in his office, he very rarely told the truth. In fact, I suspect that the only time he did not lie was when he spoke of his daughter and of his own childhood. I clung to that, the memory that had given me strength 6 years ago. Whenever I look at you now, I won't see a powerful Cardassian warrior. I will see a 6-year-old boy who is powerless to protect himself. What do you call what you did to me then, Gul Madred? Interrogation? That part was over and done with a few hours after I walked into your office. You were trying to break me to your will. Isn't that what we all do? He asked, drying off his face. Our lives in this universe are simply attempts to gain control over our surroundings. The fact that I am particularly expert at it has proved useful in my career, and provided you with an outlet to enact revenge on those who tormented you in your youth. Madred sighed. Again, you revert to amateur analysis. Yes, only this time you do not have your neural implant to get me to stop. He stared at me. I stared back. To my surprise, he looked away. Where are we going that you cannot remand me to a starbase? I thought a moment and decided I had no reason not to share the information. We are meeting a fleet of Starfleet, Klingon, and Romulan ships at the Betrica Nebula, and then proceeding to Rachnar 5 to destroy the Dominion base being constructed there. Really? Madred looked at me again, this time with a surprising intensity in his eyes. Prior to this, he was engaging in his usual tired word games, but now he seemed eager. Captain, I have intelligence that would be of use to you. I regarded him with derision. You expect me to believe that? I I am a Gul in the Central Command, Captain. I have the rank and position to know a great deal about the inner workings of our war effort, and I know what is happening at Rachel 5. And you will just give me this information. He nodded. In exchange for getting to see Glindriana. After I have spoken to her, I will gladly tell you everything I know about Rachel 5. Tell me first, then I will allow you to... No! The vehemence with which he said that one syllable almost struck me like a slap. The two security guards on duty, Horowitz and Simone, both moved their hands to their sidearms. Seeing that, Madred made a show of calming himself. I will see Glindriana, or you will receive no information from me. With that, he turned and sat back down on the bunk, staring straight ahead. You have my terms, Captain, was all he would say. I left the brig. Be quiet! He screams as he again turns on the 4 lights that he claims are 5. In spite of all you've done to me, I find you a pitiable man. Picard, stop it, he says, raising the control for the neural implant. Or I will turn this on and leave you in agony all night. I bark out a laugh and point at him. You called me Picard! What are the Federation's defense plans for Minos Corva? I give him only one answer. There are 4 lights! He activates the implant. Pain racks my body as he insists there are 5 lights. I try to resist, taking refuge in an old song from my childhood. Ironically, it was time for the appointment I'd made with Deanna. I had forgotten that I'd even made it until I was outside her office, simply wishing to speak to her again. Once again, I entered to find her reading over a pad. Captain, she said at my entrance, I'm glad you could make it. I took my seat opposite her, tugging my uniform jacket. How has the interrogation been going? I filled her in on what Madred had said, which was very little, and then told her about the trade he proposed. Deanna put a finger on her chin. Sorry, my cat is being annoying. Do you believe his intelligence will be useful? It's impossible to be sure. He is correct that he is of sufficient rank to possibly be aware of what is happening on Rachel, but he also might be lying in order to see his subordinate. I gave a half smile. Lying is Madred's modus operandi, after all. Leaning back in her chair, Deanna said, what I find curious is Madred's interest in the Glyn. Why does he wish to see her particularly? Get down from there, cat. Come on. Silly cat. Sorry, Louis was getting where he should be. Anyway. That brought me up short. I honestly hadn't given that a moment's thought. You know? I have no idea. It might be worth discovering that. I shook my head, but it almost doesn't matter. I can't fulfill my end of the bargain either way. Glindriana is dead. Therein lies my dilemma. Which is? Again, I tugged on my uniform jacket. The only way I will be able to obtain Gul Madred's intelligence is to lie to him. I must do to him what he did to me. Captain, Deanna said, leaning forward and putting a reassuring hand on mine, there is no danger of your doing to him what he did to you. He manipulated me, Counselor. He lied. He caused me pain. And in the end, he broke me. If I lie to him, if I tell him that Driana is alive and well, and gain intelligence from him, and then renege on my part of that bargain, how does that make me different from him? She removed her hand. Captain, there is a war on, and I don't accept that rationalization. Tartly, Deanna said, it's not a rationalization, Captain. Isn't it? When we use war as an excuse for extreme behavior, where does it end? Madred tortured me, ostensibly to obtain information about Minos Corva. His nation was at war with mine, or at least they intended to be. So does that justify his actions, done as they were for the greater good of the Cardassian Union? Of course not, Deanna said. I gestured in a manner that was almost pleading. Then how do I justify manipulating Madred now? Deanna stared at me for a moment, her face unusually opaque. At Richter Prime, would you consider your actions justifiable? I shrugged. The Dominion invaded Richter Prime. We were defending our territory. Exactly. But if there wasn't a state of war between the Dominion and the Federation, would your actions at Richter Prime have been justified? I hesitated. Deanna went on. You would have at least attempted a peaceful solution, but war has been declared. If there is to be a peaceful solution, it would not have happened at Richter Prime. Ethics can be situational. What you did at Richter Prime would have been a court-martial offense 3 years ago, but it's an act of heroism now. Hardly that, I said, but I did not argue the point further. Yes, all right, perhaps so, but where does it end? I think the better question is, why did it start? Again, I was brought up short. What do you mean? Now Deanna was speaking more formally, counselor to captain rather than therapist to patient. Captain, it is completely inappropriate for you to interrogate Gul Madred, and potentially damaging. Besides undermining Lieutenant Daniels' authority, you are also exposing yourself to psychological damage. Madred's treatment of you 6 years ago is a wound that his presence has ripped open. The ship cannot afford a wounded captain right now. Counselor, you don't understand. I needed... Now she was back to being a therapist. Captain, I understand completely, more than anyone, because I know the truth. As you just said, he broke you. So why do you keep going back to see him? Why do you continue to let him hold power over you? Shaking my head, I said, he doesn't have any power over me, Counselor. He's my prisoner. No, Captain. You're still his. I found I had nothing to say. The notion was ridiculous. Wasn't it? Very quietly, Deanna said, I've watched the recordings of your sessions with Madred. He has manipulated every conversation you two have had. As far as he's concerned, you never left his office, and he's still trying to break you. I thought back to the conversations in the brig and realized that, as usual, Deanna was right. I've been a fool, I whispered. No, she said, you've been a victim. That's not a crime, Captain. Perhaps not. I stood up, straightening my uniform. But allowing him to continue to victimize me is. With that, I turned and left the counselor's office. It's up to you. A life of ease and reflection and intellectual challenge. Or this. He indicates the office where I have been for the past several days, subject to his whims and manipulations. Barely able to speak, I ask, what must I do? Nothing, really. He looks up at the lights. Tell me how many lights you see. I look up. The lights blind me, but I stare directly into them. Madred has said that the Enterprise is destroyed, and that I am believed to have perished with them. I have nothing left. How many? I stare at the lights. How many lights? The door behind me opens. This is your last chance. The gods are coming. Don't be a stubborn fool. How many? I'm about to answer. To tell him that I do, in fact, see 5 lights when another Cardassian gull appears at my side. He's furious at Madred. You told me he would be ready to go. We had some unfinished business, Madred says, rather lamely. Angrily, the other gull says, get him cleaned up. A ship is waiting to take him back to the Enterprise. It was another lie. Only this time, I believed it. From my ready room, I instructed the computer to show me the feed from the brig. The station on my desk lit up, and I saw Lieutenant Daniels standing where I had stood previously. Madred sat on his bunk, looking confused. Who are you? My name is Lieutenant Daniels, Chief of Security of the Enterprise. I have a few questions for you, Gul Madred. What has happened to Captain Picard? Daniels smiled. Captain is a busy man. He has better things to do than listen to the likes of you. And then Madred threw his head back, and he laughed. I frowned. This was not what I was expecting. What's so funny? Daniel's tone was of great annoyance. Madred shook his head. From the moment I beamed onto this ship, I wondered if I would be able to learn the truth. For 6 years, I've been plagued with not knowing the answer. But now, Lieutenant, you cannot possibly know how happy you've made me. You can't imagine how little I care about your happiness, Gul. Nodding, Madred said, understandable. Still, I am, at last, satisfied. You see, I never knew if I broke him. Lamech, that tiresome fool, came in before I had my answer. I could never be sure if he remained defiant to the end, or if Lamech's entrance provided him with the hope that I had so meticulously taken away from him. Daniel shook his head. You're crazy. Am I? Given the opportunity to hold my request to see Glindriana over my head, he instead runs away, afraid to face me as a prisoner, afraid to treat me that way. I know she is dead. She had radiation poisoning, and she is allergic to hyronolin. But Picard could have lied to me, manipulated me as I did him. But when we reached the endgame, he chose to retreat rather than confront. Madred then decided to laugh some more, at which point I almost turned the screen off, but then Daniels interrupted him. Captain Picard didn't use the Glyn against you because he didn't need to, and we didn't need you. The intelligence we had was more than sufficient. The raid on Racnell 5 went off without a hitch. There's never going to be a base on that planet, Gul Madred, and you were completely helpless to prevent it. That got Madred to stop laughing, at least, but he was still smiling. It doesn't matter. I've won. Daniels asked a few more questions, but Madred said nothing. Disgusted, I turned off the screen and went back to the bridge. Will and Deanna were both seated at their places on the bridge when I came out. The former said, Captain Kartok has beamed down an occupation force to hold Racnell 5. We've been ordered to deliver Gul Madred to Starbase 522. Grand. I'll be glad to be rid of him. I sat in my seat, my two trusted advisors on either side. From my left, Deanna said, "You should be proud, Captain. Madred is a bully, and ultimately the only way to defeat a bully is not to engage him." She smiled at me. "You won." I thought about how close I came to admitting to there being 5 lights 6 years ago, and how easily I let Madred once again trap me in his web of words 3 days ago, and I shook my head. This does not feel like victory. And that's the story. This anthology also has stories by Christopher L. Bennett, Greg Cox, Bob Ingersoll and Thomas F. Zahler, David A. McEntee, Scott Pearson, Michael Schuster and Steve Molman, Susan Schwartz, Amy Sisson, James Swallow, Jeff Trowbridge, Dayton Warden, Kevin Dillmore, and Richard C. White. There are stories that focus on pretty much every character, including my personal favorite. Greg Cox did a story that featured Ensign Rowe, Lieutenant Barclay, and Waxana Troy working together. It was beautiful. There's also, if you remember the episode Tapestry, where Picard basically lived a life where he didn't engage the Nausicaans and wound up as a junior science officer on the Enterprise, and the captain of the Enterprise is a man named Thomas Holloway. There's a story in here by Michael Schuster and Steve Molman, a 2-part story that bookends the anthology, that focuses on the mainline version of Holloway and who he is and how he almost got command of the Enterprise. It's pretty nifty. Anyway, lots of good stuff in here. I strongly recommend it if you're a Next Generation fan. Thank you very much for watching. You can find me online at DeCandido.net. Read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com. And please, if you could support me on Patreon, that would be awesome. It's at patreon.com/KRAD. Thank you, and stay safe.